They say love begins with words, but sometimes it begins with silence and the courage to finally break it. Rain hammered against the windows of the parking garage as Isla sat frozen in her car, tears streaming down her face. Her hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching through the storm. She didn't see him until his knuckles rapped gently against the glass. Nolan. She closed her eyes, but the tears kept coming. When she finally looked up, his face was etched with concern, confusion, something deeper she couldn't name. He gestured for her to roll down the window. She shook her head. He knocked again, softer this time. Isla, please. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle.
I can't do this anymore.
The cold night air rushed in as she stepped out, wrapping her arms around herself.
Just listen to me.
They stood there in the dim fluorescent light in clay, the distant hum of the city barely audible over the rain. Talk to me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head again, harder. You don't understand. Then help me understand. Something in his tone, the raw honesty of it, cracked something inside her. She looked away, trying to find words that had been locked inside for 3 years. You think I was distant because I didn't like you, she said, her voice trembling. But the truth is I couldn't afford to. He stood perfectly still, waiting. I've admired you since the day I walked into this company, she continued, the words spilling out now, unstoppable. Your vision, your integrity, the way you see people, not as assets, but as human beings. But I couldn't be the woman who made it because of her boss. I couldn't let anyone think my work wasn't mine, that every promotion was a favor, that I was just someone who got close to the CEO. Her voice broke, and she pressed her palm against her eyes, but the tears wouldn't stop. So I built walls, too high, too strong. I turned down promotions because they came from you. I wrote that resignation letter a dozen times because staying hurt, but leaving would have hurt more. And every single day I had to pretend you were just another executive when you were. She couldn't finish. The words died in her throat. Nolan took a step closer, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel his presence. You think you were the only one pretending? His voice was thick with emotion. I spent 3 years wishing you'd look at me, really look at me. But every time you did, I froze, terrified of crossing a line, of losing your respect, of becoming the boss who couldn't see past his own feelings. He paused, his jaw tight. You stayed because you thought I didn't see you. But Isla, I've seen you every single day. The way you protect your team, the way you challenge me in meetings when everyone else just agrees, the way you care so deeply you have to hide it just to survive. And it terrified me how much I wanted to know the person behind those walls. They stood in the echo of the parking garage. No music, no distractions, just silence and truth hanging between them like something fragile and precious. But to understand how we got here, you need to know how it all began. If you've ever loved someone but were too afraid to say it, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the end. Because sometimes the person who seems furthest from you is the one who's been closest all along. And I promise you, this story will remind you why silence can be both a prison and a protection. 3 years earlier, Nolan Pierce stood alone in his corner office on the 42nd floor of Pierce Systems. The city sprawled out below him like a constellation of broken promises. On his desk sat a photograph from the company retreat, a rare, candid shot of his team, but his eyes were fixed on only one face. Isla Vance. Brilliant, composed, and colder than winter itself. He'd spent 3 years wondering what he'd done to make her hate him. 3 years of polite nods and professional distance, 3 years of feeling like a stranger to the one person whose respect he craved most. People think success buys peace, but sometimes the higher you climb, the louder the silence becomes. And in that silence, Nolan had built an entire story about who Isla was, a story that was about to be proven wrong in every possible way. It started on a Tuesday morning when he arrived at his office to find a wrapped gift on his desk. The paper was simple, elegant, the kind of attention to detail that spoke of genuine care. He picked up the card. Congratulations on 7 years. Wishing you and your wife many more. IV. He stared at it, his stomach sinking. His assistant Marcus appeared in the doorway with his usual morning coffee. Someone's thoughtful, Marcus said, nodding at the gift. Anniversary present? I've been divorced for 2 years, Nolan said quietly. Marcus's smile faltered. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize." "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nolan unwrapped the gift carefully. Inside was a book on transformational leadership, one he'd mentioned wanting to read in a staff meeting months ago. As he flipped through the pages, he noticed handwritten notes in the margins, thoughtful annotations, insights, questions that showed she'd actually read it before giving it to him. She cared enough to try, but the walls between them were so high, she didn't even know the fundamental truth of his life. He found her in the break room an hour later, standing by the window with her coffee, her posture perfect, her face unreadable. When she saw him approaching, something flickered across her expression. Fear? Embarrassment? It was gone before he could name it. "The gift was thoughtful," he said, keeping his voice gentle, "but I'm not married anymore, haven't been for 2 years. The coffee cup trembled slightly in her hand. I apologize, Mr. Pierce, that was inappropriate. It won't happen again. Isla." But she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the tile with mechanical precision. He stood there holding the book, looking at her careful notes in the margins, and realized something that made his chest ache. She'd tried to reach across the distance between them and gotten everything wrong because he'd been just as closed off as she was. Maybe, he thought, they didn't know each other at all. The next few weeks, Nolan started paying attention in a way he hadn't before. Not as a boss monitoring an employee, but as someone trying to understand a puzzle he'd been staring at for years without really seeing. He noticed how Isla stayed late every Thursday to mentor a junior analyst who was struggling with data modeling. He watched her bring coffee to the night security guard every morning, remembering his name, asking about his daughter's college applications. He saw the way she shielded her team from executive pressure in meetings, taking the heat herself so they could focus on their work. And he saw something else, something that made his throat tight. During presentations, her hands trembled slightly before she spoke. She'd clench them together, take a breath, and then deliver with flawless confidence. But the fear was there, hidden beneath layers of control. She wasn't cold. She was terrified, and she'd been hiding it for 3 years. Late one evening, Nolan was reviewing quarterly reports when he reached for the projector cables during a strategy session. His hand bumped Isla's bag, and papers scattered across the table. He bent to help gather them. And that's when he saw it. A resignation letter, printed on company letterhead, addressed to him, dated 8 months ago. His heart stopped. The letter was formal, professional, thanking the company for the opportunity. 4s, but it had never been submitted, never even signed, just printed, folded, and carried in her bag like a promise she couldn't quite keep. Isla snatched it away quickly, her face flushing. "That's nothing." "It's dated March," he said carefully. "I said it's nothing." Her voice was sharp now, defensive. She shoved the papers back into her bag and stood. "If we're done here, I have work to finish." She left before he could respond, and Nolan sat there in the empty conference rooms, full of his mind racing. She'd written it, addressed it, but never sent it. Why would someone so brilliant, so clearly unhappy, choose to stay in a place that seemed to cause her pain? The question haunted him. He started noticing more. The way she took the stairs instead of the elevator when she thought no one was watching, like she needed those few minutes alone to breathe. The way she ate lunch at her desk, always working, never joining the others in the cafeteria. The way she flinched just slightly when he praised her work in front of the board. 2 months after the gift incident, after a particularly tense board meeting where Isla had presented a controversial restructuring proposal, Nolan found her in the hallway. The executives had torn into her recommendations, questioned her data, suggested she didn't understand the market realities. She'd held her ground with icy professionalism, but he'd seen the cost in the tightness around her eyes. "You could work anywhere," he said, falling into step beside her. "Top firms would hire you in a heartbeat. Why stay somewhere that makes you miserable?" She stopped walking and turned to face him. For the first time in 3 years, she really looked at him, not through him or past him, but directly into his eyes. The moment stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. "Not everything is as simple as it looks, Mr. Pierce," she said quietly. "Sometimes staying is the hardest choice of all." Then she walked away, leaving him standing in the empty hallway, her words echoing in his head like a riddle he desperately needed to solve. He didn't get the chance to ask what she meant. The following Friday, everything changed. The storm hit at 6 in the evening, rain lashing against the glass walls of Pierce systems like nature itself was trying to break through. By 7, the emergency alerts started. A critical security breach, the kind that could destroy years of client trust and cost millions in damages, the kind that sent everyone into crisis mode. Nolan's phone exploded with calls, board members, clients, the IT team scrambling to contain the damage. By 9, most of the staff had left, exhausted and defeated, trusting the senior team to handle the aftermath. By midnight, only 2 people remained in the operations room, Nolan and Isla. The space felt different at night, intimate in a way the bustling daytime office never was. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the city below was a blur of wet light. They worked in focused silence, the only sounds the clicking of keyboards and the occasional frustrated sigh. Nolan pulled up the breach report and felt his stomach drop. He scrolled back through the archives, found what he was looking for, and closed his eyes. "Your report from March?" he said quietly. "You predicted this. Exactly this." Isla didn't look up from her screen. Predictions don't matter if no one listens. "I'm listening now." She glanced at him, surprise flickering across her face before the walls came back up. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the late hour or the feeling that they were the only 2 people in the world fighting this battle together. Whatever it was, the air between them felt different, charged with possibility. "The vulnerability is in the legacy authentication system," she said, pulling up a diagram. "I recommended we migrate to zero-trust architecture 6 months ago, but the board said it was too expensive. How do we fix it now?" "We can't. Not completely. We can patch it, contain the damage, but the fundamental flaw will still be there until we do the migration properly." She rubbed her eyes, and he noticed the dark circles beneath them. "I'm sorry. I should have pushed harder." "You did push. We didn't listen. That's on us, not you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression cracked. Not much, just a hairline fracture in the armor, but enough that he could see the exhaustion and frustration beneath. "Coffee?" he offered. She nodded. He returned with 2 cups from the executive kitchen, the good stuff they kept for clients. When he handed her one, their fingers brushed, and neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact lasted only a second longer than necessary, but it felt like an earthquake. "Thank you," she said softly. They worked for 3 more hours, side by side, their earlier distance replaced by something that felt almost like partnership. At one point, she actually laughed, at a dark joke he made about the board's risk assessment process. The sound was rusty, like she was out of practice, but it was genuine. For the first time in 3 years, they shared silence that didn't feel like distance. It felt like understanding. By 3 in the morning, they'd stabilized the system. The crisis wasn't over, but it was contained. Isla stood, stretching her back, and started gathering her things. "The system's stable," she said, her voice suddenly tight. "I should go." "Isla, wait." But she was already moving, too quickly, her hands shaking as she shoved her laptop into her bag. Something was wrong. He could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. This wasn't professional distance. This was panic. "Isla." She didn't stop. She was at the door now, her hand on the handle. "I need to go," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. Nolan watched her disappear into the hallway, heard the elevator doors close, and something in his chest told him not to let her leave like this. Not after tonight. Not after 3 years of distance and misunderstanding. He grabbed his jacket and followed. The parking garage was cold and empty, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the concrete. He found her sitting in her car, both hands on the steering wheel, her shoulders shaking. Rain pounded against the metal roof like a drum beat. He approached slowly, carefully, and knocked on her window. She didn't move, didn't look at him, just sat there with tears streaming down her face, and Nolan felt something inside him break at the sight of her pain. He knocked again, softer. "Isla, please." Her hand trembled as it reached for the door handle. When she stepped out, the cold air hit them both, but neither seemed to notice. They stood in the dim light, the city's distant sounds barely audible over the storm. "Talk to me," he said. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "You don't understand." Then help me understand. The words hung between them. She looked away, her jaw clenched, fighting some internal battle. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. You think I was distant because I didn't like you, but the truth is, I couldn't afford to. He stayed quiet, giving her space to continue. I've admired you since the day I walked into this company, she said, and now the words came faster, like a dam breaking. Your vision, your integrity, the way you see people not as assets but as human beings. But I couldn't be the woman who made it because of her boss. I couldn't let anyone think my work wasn't mine, that every promotion was a favor, that I was just someone who got close to the CEO. Tears fell freely now, and she didn't bother wiping them away. So I built walls, too high, too strong. I turned down 3 promotions because they came from you. I wrote that resignation letter a dozen times because staying hurt, but leaving would have hurt more, and every single day I had to pretend you were just another executive when you were. Her voice broke completely. She pressed her palms against her eyes, her whole body shaking. Nolan stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth in the cold garage. His own eyes were wet now, his throat tight with 3 years of buried feelings. You think you were the only one pretending? His voice came out rough, raw. I spent 3 years wishing you'd look at me, really look at me. But every time you did, I froze, terrified of crossing a line, of losing your respect, of becoming the boss who couldn't see past his own feelings. He paused, forcing himself to say the words he'd locked away for so long. You stayed because you thought I didn't see you. But Isla, I've seen you every single day. The way you protect your team, take blame that isn't yours so they can grow. The way you challenge me in meetings when everyone else just agrees. The way you care so deeply you have to hide it just to survive. And it terrified me how much I wanted to know the person behind those walls. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. How much I wanted you to trust me enough to let them down. They stood there in the silence, the rain echoing around them, both of them stripped bare in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. No titles, no company hierarchy, just 2 people who'd been circling each other in fear and longing for 3 years, finally telling the truth. I was afraid, Isla whispered. Afraid that if I let myself feel this, I'd lose everything I'd worked for. Afraid that people would look at me and only see your assistant, your girlfriend, your mistake. Not me. Never just me. You could never be just anything, Nolan said fiercely. You're the most brilliant person I've ever worked with, the strongest. And I swear to you, if we do this, if we try, I will spend every day making sure the world sees what I see, that your success is yours, that you earned every bit of it. How? Her voice was small, broken. How do we do this without destroying everything? Carefully, he said. Honestly, we do it right or we don't do it at all. She looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face for certainty, for promise, for something to hold on to. And what she found there made her breath catch. I'm scared, she admitted. Me too. They stood there for another moment, and then Isla took a shaky breath and nodded. Not an agreement, not yet, but an acknowledgement, a possibility. I need time, she said, to think, to figure out how this could even work. Take all the time you need. I've waited 3 years. I can wait longer. She almost smiled at that, a ghost of the expression, fragile and new. Then she got back in her car and he watched her drive away into the rain, his heart pounding with fear and hope in equal measure. The days that followed were strange, suspended, like they were both holding their breath. They didn't avoid each other, but they didn't seek each other out either. They were professional in meetings, careful with their words, hyper-aware of every glance and gesture. On the 5th day, Isla appeared in his office doorway. She was dressed in her usual armor, perfect suit, hair pulled back, expression composed, but her hands were clasped tightly together. I'm requesting a transfer, she said without preamble, to the strategy division. Different reporting structure, different team. Nolan's chest tightened, but he kept his voice level. You don't have to do that. I do. She stepped into the office and closed the door behind her. But not because I'm running, because I want this to be real. No questions, no doubts, no whispers about favoritism or impropriety. I want to earn my place on my own terms, and then, if this thing between us is real, we build it on solid ground. He studied her face, saw the determination there, the steel beneath the fear. This was her taking control, refusing to be a victim of circumstance or perception. "Okay," he said quietly, "but Isla, promise me something." "What?" "Don't hold back anymore. Not your ideas, not your ambitions, not anything. The world needs to see what you're capable of, and I need to know you're not dimming your light for anyone, not even me." Something shifted in her expression, softened. For the first time since that night in the parking garage, she smiled at him without hesitation. "I promise." The transfer went through within 2 weeks. Isla moved to strategy, reporting directly to the COO, and slowly, carefully, they began. 3 months later, Isla stood in front of the executive board presenting a major infrastructure initiative. It was ambitious, expensive, and would require buy-in from every department, the kind of proposal that could make or break a career. One of the senior executives, Thomas Garrett, leaned forward with a skeptical frown. He was old guard, the type who'd built his empire on gut instinct and resisted every innovation. "This seems like an unnecessary risk," Garrett said, his tone dismissive. "We've managed fine with our current systems. Why fix what isn't broken?" The old Isla would have retreated into cold professionalism, presented more data, let the criticism slide off her armor. But something had changed. She stood straighter, met his gaze directly. "With respect, Mr. Garrett, it is broken. We've had 3 security incidents in the past year, each one more costly than the last. The March breach alone cost us $4 million and 2 major clients. This isn't about fixing what works, it's about preventing catastrophic failure." Garrett's face reddened. "Are you suggesting we've been negligent?" "I'm suggesting we've been lucky, and luck isn't a strategy." Her voice was calm, confident, unwavering. "The data supports this investment, the risk assessment supports it, and frankly, our competitors are already ahead of us. We can either lead or follow, but we can't pretend the landscape hasn't changed." The room fell silent. Nolan sat at the far end of the table, careful to keep his expression neutral, but inside his chest swelled with pride. This was the Isla the world needed to see, the one who'd been hiding behind walls for too long. The COO cleared her throat. "I think Miss Vance makes an excellent point. Let's table this for detailed review and reconvene next week." After the meeting, Nolan found Isla in the hallway. They'd been careful about public interactions, professional and appropriate, but he couldn't help the smile that crossed his face. That was impressive. She glanced around to make sure they were alone, then allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Old me would have let him steamroll the whole proposal. What changed? She met his eyes, and there was something luminous in her expression, something free. "I stopped being afraid of taking up space." They stood there for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken things, and then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the hallway with his heart full. Their relationship grew in the spaces between work, in early morning coffee walks before the office filled, in late night phone calls that started about business and drifted into laughter and stories and dreams. They were careful, discreet, but not hidden. They simply existed as 2 people discovering each other without the weight of professional hierarchy crushing every moment. 6 months after that night in the parking garage, Isla's promotion came through. Vice President of Strategy, announced by the COO in a company-wide meeting, earned through a competitive review process that involved external consultants and blind evaluations. When her name was called, the applause was genuine, her achievement untainted by whispers or speculation. Nolan caught her eye across the crowded conference room and saw everything he needed to know in her expression. Pride, relief, joy. She'd done it on her own terms, and no one could ever take that away from her. At the company's annual gala 3 months later, they arrived separately but gravitated toward each other naturally, the way planets orbit in predictable patterns. They weren't hiding anymore, but they weren't performing either. They simply were, standing side by side at the bar, his hand occasionally brushing the small of her back, her laugh genuine and unguarded. A year after that parking garage confession, Nolan stood on a stage at the Global Leadership Summit, looking out at hundreds of faces from companies around the world. Isla sat in the 3rd row, calm and composed, wearing the deep blue dress he'd told her, made her eyes look like the ocean. The smartest decisions I've made weren't about market strategy or technological innovation, he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. They were about people, about listening to the warnings others ignore, about recognizing that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. He paused, his eyes finding hers in the crowd. I once worked with someone who taught me that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's protection, sometimes it's strength, and sometimes it's just fear waiting for courage. The best thing I ever did as a leader was learn to listen to what wasn't being said and create space for honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, especially when it was uncomfortable. The applause swelled, but Nolan barely heard it. He only saw Isla, her eyes bright with unshed tears, smiling at him with a warmth that still took his breath away. When he stepped off stage, she was waiting. He took her hand, not hidden or hesitant, just certain, and they walked out together into the cool evening air. Good speech, she said softly. I had a good teacher. She laughed, that sound he'd once thought he'd never hear, now as familiar as his own heartbeat. They stood on the steps of the convention center, the city lights spreading out before them like possibilities, and Nolan pulled her close. Do you ever regret it? He asked. The walls, the distance, all that time we lost? Isla was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she shook her head. No, because it made this real. We didn't rush. We didn't take shortcuts. We built something that can weather anything because it's built on respect and truth, not just desire. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw their whole story, the misunderstandings and the silence and the courage it took to finally break through. We needed the distance to appreciate the closeness, she said. We needed the silence to value our words, and we needed the fear to recognize the bravery. He kissed her then, soft and certain, and she melted into him the way she never could have 3 years ago when her walls were still standing. They say love begins with words, but sometimes it begins with silence and the courage to finally break it. Behind Isla's silence wasn't hatred or indifference. It was hope, carefully guarded and desperately protected. And all it needed was someone brave enough to listen, patient enough to wait, and strong enough to meet her in the truth. Sometimes the person who seems furthest from you is the one who's been closest all along. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very prisons we need to escape. And sometimes love doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or passionate declarations. Sometimes it whispers in parking garages and late-night crisis rooms and quiet moments of honest vulnerability. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment telling me about a time you were too afraid to speak your truth, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that remind us we're all just humans trying to find connection in a complicated world. Because in the end, we all have our silences. We all have our walls, and we all deserve someone willing to wait on the other side until we're brave enough to let them in.